The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor. I am doing extremely well, and I am joined by Greg, who is not, unfortunately. You have had a rough week, Greg. How are things going?
Oh, I would not let just a little thing like COVID prevent me from joining you this week and getting our podcast in. That's how devoted I am to finishing this book at this point, is I didn't want to delay getting to read the next few chapters any more than I could. So things are looking up. I'm rested. I have tons of fluids, and I'm ready to talk Wheel of Time.
Yeah, Greg is definitely at the desperately needs 25 pages of new book to read phase of COVID. I can relate hard. Unless there's anything else that is pressing, I see you making a face like there is not. I suggest that we dive into an ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast or something along those lines. This week, we are going to be talking about the chapter icon on chapter 46, the icon that I lovingly refer to as Sleepy Time Tree. The reason for this will become apparent in the next episode when we record another ill-advised discussion of the other tree icon on chapters. But for now, I just want to throw briefly to you, Greg. What do you think when you see this image? Is there anything that stands out to you visually? And then we can talk about kind of what it symbolizes in chapters.
Yeah. So again, listeners, if you want to see the icon, go find the post on Twitter and Instagram, where I will hopefully have put this up the day this drops, so you can see the icon for our discussion. I will say what stands out most to me looking at this particular icon is the layering of the colors, right? Yeah. That we have the deep background it's kind of the lowest layer is black with a white moon on it, for lack of a better understanding of it, and then a black tree layered on top of the moon with white outlined, adding some of the details to the tree. So, especially as we've continued to talk through this book, and we've talked a lot about the kind of duality of black and white and the symbolism there, the fact that this particular one has layer upon layer makes me think about, the deep time issues we've been talking about, but also just the complexities here, that it is often not actually as simple as black and white. There are increasing complexities to it. And I think, having read this chapter, I think this chapter is all about the complexities to people we might have cast in a certain light previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, I think what you're saying is kind of exactly along a line that I honestly hadn't considered with this symbol until maybe the last time that I read this book. I had always kind of viewed my lovingly referred to Sleepy Time Tree. I think of it as that because it's basically a chapter icon that in most cases covers relatively boring chapters that are either at night or in the forest, right? It's not a super descript icon. It's not something that when you see it, you immediately know what is going to be happening in the chapter. I tend to think of it as kind of the chapter icon for like nothing super important is going to happen plot-wise. But as you're talking about like kind of all of the layering, as you're talking about what's in this chapter compared to what's not, it makes me think the last couple times I've seen this image, it reminds me a little bit of like Loyal and the idea that Ogier have these kind of long memories. And as you're now talking about deep time, I think there is something to be said for the fact that we're seeing this chapter icon. I think it's the chapter icon on the chapters where Rand is going through the wood at the beginning of the book and Tam is kind of slowly telling
Hmm.
his story in his delirium, or it's the symbol here when we're getting the background about Lan that we've kind of been lacking for the entire book. And so I think there is something to be said for this being a symbol that says something about time or history being included in the chapter. But that kind of sits on top of my initial reading, which is like, this is just kind of the boring chapter icon.
Yeah, and I mean, there's obviously we've talked before about a lot of mythologies that use trees in the world tree in Norse mythology and so on. But to think about all of that being true at once, that it is both when we get good mythology and also it's a little boring. What came to mind is I had a large number of friends who tried to read Lord of the Rings when the movies were coming out, and they all made it to the Council of Elrond chapter, just like you
Yep.
knew they would, and then they quit. And like you can't blame them. It's a very long slog. So I think Council of Elrond deserves a sleepy time tree.
Yes, that is 100% accurate. Because if you're going to get through it, you're going to get through it because of the weird little details in that annoyingly long meeting that we had to read about. I think that's basically all that I have to say about Sleepy Time Tree. But while we are ill advisedly discussing visual things, I actually suggest we flip exactly one page further back in our books and briefly talk about the visual icon that you were excited about,
Mm.
the map that happened right before the beginning of chapter 46. So I know you were really excited just to see a map and know that that was going to be relevant coming up. So I'm curious your thoughts, whether you were flipping back to this map as you were reading the chapter, whether it was helpful, and is there anything on it that jumped out at you when you were just kind of first absorbing it, either a few weeks ago or this week? I'm not quite sure when you really let yourself take a good look at it.
Well, I was immediately flipping between this and the map at the beginning of the book, trying to piece together, okay, what is being added here? And,
Yeah.
roughly speaking, it's just a classic inset where it's like, okay, we gave you this rough area, and now we're going to show you this in more detail. So we're zooming in on this new part of the world. I did the funny thing where I was like, this doesn't match up, and then noticed, of course, that the compass rose turned slightly
Yep.
on this map. So it does exactly match up. They weren't that foolish, but it was a good reminder not to immediately push up my nerd glasses and be like, actually,
as a
yeah.
as a dungeon master, let me just say I hate any map where north isn't up. They ruin my life. You can continue.
Yeah. Oh, especially in roll 20,
Oh,
low these pandemic months. I will say, and this will be the bridge to the chapter, is a lot of this, I'm going to say for me, was reminiscent of Game of Thrones, which I recognize is the reverse of how I should be considering that Game of Thrones is perhaps reminiscent of this, but this idea essentially of the end of the world. And
yeah.
there's a sense as the chapters go on that the world didn't used to end here, and it has, darker forces have encroached and pushed back the forces of light. And all of that is just simply compelling. I mean, it's very compelling as it is in Game of Thrones, and I think the real life analog is Hadrian's Wall, I believe it's called,
Yeah.
in England. And I always just loved that idea that Rome got like really far away, and then they're like, you know what? Let's just end here. Let's just build a wall and leave those weirdos on the other side. Like, who needs to rule the world? We got to here. This seems like a good end. So, that's not quite what it is here. It's kind of closer to what it is in Game of Thrones, but
Yeah.
it's a funny way to think about the edge of a map.
It is. And I really like the idea of thinking of kind of the blight as encroaching and kind of slowly moving forward, because it takes that metaphor that we see with Hadrian's Wall or in Game of Thrones with the wall. But both of those are kind of immobile objects, right? Someone has
Mm,
put a line in the sand and said it won't go beyond that. What I really like about both this map and what we learn in the chapter is just that we get to see on this map, we've heard mention of the seven towers many times, and to see it on the other side of the dotted line, I feel like is really effective at just showing the blight isn't just the terrible thing up north. It's the terrible thing up north that's a little more south than it used to be. And I
mm,
think that's an interesting addition compared to some of the other versions of this that we've seen in other stories and in the real world. That being said, let's dive right into the chapter.
Whoa,
So,
whoa, 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 whoa.
or
Before
don't.
we leave the map, let's talk about the iconography around the edges of the map, because to
Mm,
me that's a really interesting touch here, because there's a lot of things here that are familiar to our story so far. You know, we've seen this sword that is on the top and bottom,
yep.
and the trefoil leaves wrapped around the sword. All right, that's all familiar. Uh, seemingly Moraine on a horse, or a woman on a horse. The figure is clearly feminine.
Yep.
Wolves, which have been such a prominent part of our story. But what I'm building up to is there's a big dragon on the top right corner.
Yep.
And is that part of how we're just supposed to interpret this as the dark one, Beelzemon? You know, we have seen some hints of this before, but like this isn't the Hobbit. Like we haven't had a dragon in this story. And I would
And
note,
in
yeah, go
fact, I
for it.
do just want to quickly note in the prologue, we learn that our characters don't know what a dragon is. They
Mm,
only know the word dragon as corresponding to Luz Therin. They have
okay.
no idea that that is an actual creature. Sorry, continue.
Well, and my last point is just that the placement of the two, so that seemingly the Aes Sedai figure is down next to Tar Valon, whereas the dragon is up across the wall, as it were, or deep in the blight. So, and the pointing of the swords, I mean, it's all arranged to kind of set up that confrontation. So, didn't want to not enjoy those, because those would be better tattoos than the map itself if you're working on any of that. All right, take us into the chapter then.
Excellent. All right. Chapter 46, Fal Dara, begins with our characters in the country of Shinar. Did I write that down correctly? Checking the map. Yes, that is correct. Just maybe an hour or two outside of the city of Fal Dara. Notably, it is extremely cold, despite the fact that it is spring. Lan says that, well, this is a little colder than he would expect. The borderlands are just exceptionally cold all of the time. He describes the trees exploding if the sap gets too cold in the winter. The other notable thing is that all of the farms that they pass seem to be abandoned. And both Egwene and Perrin, using different methods, are able to determine that these farms are relatively recently abandoned. So something is going on in the city. Eventually, they make their way into the city, but before they do, they have a brief discussion amongst themselves about what kind of their objective is and where they're going at the Eye of the World. The interesting detail we learn here is that no one can visit the Green Man twice, and apparently the Green Man is wherever the Eye of the World is. They then finally make their way into the city. As they do, Lan instructs them that they need to lower their hoods because no one is allowed to have their face covered in the city so that fades can't get inside. Once they get inside, everyone greets Lan warmly. They seem to kind of recognize him, and they immediately start calling him Dai Shan, which isn't a title that we have heard for him before, and they repeatedly reference the golden crane as being raised. Soon, all of our characters are brought in front of the Lord of the city, Lord Agelmar, and he basically tells them there is going to be a battle fought at Tarwin's Gap. There have been battles along the Blight all winter, and now it seems that the Trollocs are kind of massing to try to destroy the city and destroy this kingdom, and it seems pretty apocalyptic. These characters immediately assume that Lan and Moraine are there to help them in this great battle, and they can turn the tide. And when Moraine says, no, we're going to the Blight alone, please don't help us, it creates a bit of a stir. There's some debate among them, but eventually Agelmar kind of comes along to their side and understands this is your fight, I have my fight. But it seems at this point he's kind of resigned to going off to die in the Blight, right? He doesn't believe that he has the forces to hold back the Trollocs that are coming. It's at this point, I've possibly missed a couple of details, but that's summaries, where Agelmar is told that there is someone who has been trying to climb the city walls and they've been acting suspiciously. They bring that individual before the group, and they realize very quickly that the individual who has been brought before them is Padan Fain, the peddler who they met all the way back in the Two Rivers, who apparently has been following them ever since, and it appears was both the madman who was foretold in Berlon, and then the peddler, or not the peddler, the beggar in Camelin, who was chasing Rand around, as well as very likely the person who followed them through the ways. So this resolves a
Hmm.
number of mysteries that we've had coming after us, and we end the chapter with Moraine saying that she needs to question Fane immediately, and they are going to do that. So this is a chapter that I think hints at a lot of revelations, but doesn't yet give us all the details. That's to come in the following chapter. So I'm curious what your reaction was to this not really action packed, but also not super lore packed chapter. It feels like it's moving the pieces around a little bit. So I'm curious what you picked out of the chapter.
Yeah, I think that's right. It feels like a middle ground. We joke a lot about how the plot chapters will be short episodes and the mythology chapters will be long episodes. And this does seem to split that difference pretty neatly. And yet it just continues to impress me in chapters like this how Robert Jordan kind of lays down all these details and mysteries
Yeah.
and only waits, like you said, a chapter to like resolve them. Yet it feels so good to get them resolved. One
Yeah.
chapter later, you're like, ah, yeah, there it is. Like, oh, I remember that detail. And you're like, right, because I read it 2 days ago. Um,
Yeah, I feel like
so
Robert Jordan is just really good at giving you the last big clue right in time that you either figure it out or at least remember it when the reveal happens. Sorry, you can continue.
No, I think that's right. So, I think most of my notes here are kind of character bits, right?
Yeah.
And so I can't say that I have like a singular one that I think like this is the one that matters. I mean, probably if there's one that matters, it's the peddler. And don't think I forgot that you made me predict. And I was like, there's nobody left. We've kept up with everybody. Oh, right, that random peddler from 800 pages ago. Fine,
Yep.
Tyler. Yep, I
Uh,
forgot about him.
800 pages is a pretty short gap for a character to re-show up in these books. I just want to be clear.
Oh, well, so picking up a couple of those things, I did like, and these are all just things you mentioned in your summary. So I really liked how in those opening moments when everybody's trying to get their bearings and figure out this country they're in, that it was like the river folk who were reading the buildings and had some expertise there. It just felt like a role reversal. It wasn't that they were telling Moraine and Land things they didn't know, but it was like they had pieced the clues together first or just were the first to say it. And I just kind of liked that they were taking the lead, and it seemed to show that, I mean, this book hasn't demeaned them at all for being simple farmer folks, but like it's like, oh no, there is wisdom and truth in what they do, and we're showing that off here.
Yeah, in one of the Dungeons and Dragons groups that I play in, rather than being a dungeon master, we kind of have a running joke that everyone takes these like very humble backgrounds that gives them like expertise in farming or knowledge about glassware. And anytime one of us gets to roll like a farming check, everyone at the table gets super excited about it. And this felt like that moment to me. It's like, yeah, Lan, you're the world's greatest warrior. Moraine, you can summon fireballs, but I understand how curtains work. And these people have only been here for 1 week. And I just think that's a really great moment to give characters who are kind of novices, but they do have their own types of expertise. It's just not adventuring expertise.
Yeah, and we've seen continually the way Nynaeve gets to contribute, and it's very akin to that. Like there is just a different kind of like ground up wisdom that these top down folks don't quite have. And so in that same early section, kind of before the Fal Dara, I was just struck, Rand really tries hard to convince Egwene and Loyal to leave. Like, you
Yeah.
don't have to go through with this, you should leave me behind. And they use the pattern and the weaving and the mythology there to really justify that no, like we're in this now and we're pulled into this. But the most striking to me in that little passage is that Nynaeve is saying like, I believe Moraine, right? Like she was
Yeah.
very loyal to Moraine and said, it's essentially, forgive me, it's been a few days and I have COVID brain, but says essentially like she believes we need to be here, so we're going to be here. Like she says it, so it's going to be so.
Yeah, and that's such a departure from Nynaeve as we saw her the last time we were in her head, which unfortunately, because of the way the Eye of the World works, has been hundreds and hundreds of pages. But the last big Nynaeve Moraine moment that we had was Nynaeve basically dedicating herself to becoming an Aes Sedai to destroy Moraine. So I think we definitely want to be, and I think your instincts are right, to really key in on any moment where Nynaeve is saying, I trust this woman, because that is a relatively rare thing. And so that I think definitely stood out to me. The other moment kind of related to that that jumped out at me is this is the second time that Rand has reassured Matt about something Perrin has said by referring to Moraine being okay with it. And so I think this just tells us towards the end of this book, this is not a group that is kind of fractured by being separated. It actually seems that the trials of all of these characters having to go without Moraine has brought them closer to her. And this is something I think we've seen a few instances of, but this chapter really makes it clear kind of right before we get to the conclusion of the book. And that's useful shorthand that I think Robert Jordan is giving us right before we hit kind of the climax where we might forget all of these details.
I mean, it's storytelling 101, and I always teach my first year students this at college when we do narrative writing. It's like the simplest way to show character growth is put the character in the same situation again or a very similar one
Yeah.
and show them reacting differently. And yet it's always amazing to me, I was just reading a sci-fi book this afternoon, and it was like they invented this little scene to try to like make you think there was growth right before the climax. And it's like, no, you like don't do that. Like don't throw in that random new bit of exposition at a
Yeah.
given moment. All you have to do is show the person come against the same type of obstacle twice and deal with it very differently. And I think that's exactly what you're saying is we can see the difference in all these characters here as we move into what I presume, based on the small amount of book left, is the climax of the book.
Yeah, it's a remarkably small climax, which I think is something that we should know as we get close to the end of this book.
That's
That's
what
pretty.
she said. Yes. Oh, sorry. This is not an explicit podcast. So,
If Steve Carell can say it on NBC, we can say it on a podcast. It's fine. Um, I am kind of curious now we get into Fal Dara, what your reaction was both to kind of the hyping up of Lan as a character and then the interesting reveal. You've been saying for weeks and weeks, I don't think there's going to be a big battle at the end of this book. Well, someone's going to fight a big battle at the end of this book. So I'm curious what you thought about that being kind of piled on to all of the other plot we've already got going.
well, I made a mistake when I was taking my notes, but yet I actually think it's illustrative, which is I wrote as they reach Fal Dara, and then I said Moraine is well known here. And I had clearly misread two or three of those opening cues where they're all excited to see this party arrive.
Yeah.
Like they're all here for Moraine, like it's Moraine time. And why I think that's illustrative is I do actually think that's a little bit of the play going on here. It's like you've
Yeah.
put all your hopes in Moraine, but it's like, oh no, you forgot about land, right? While the Moraine hand was moving, the land hand was moving as well. So, I think I'll save the majority of my comments about that till next chapter when we get that filled in. But I think there was something very familiar about this kind of construction of a place desperate for help. I mean, it is the wall in Game of Thrones. They
Yeah.
were shutting down towers and kind of consolidating. Um, and it's Gondor in Lord of the Rings, right? That they've been on the front line. The orcs have been raiding. They took Osgiliath. God, old Tolkien knowledge just somewhere in my brain sprung to life.
That's solid.
Yeah, it must have been part of the video game, is all I can figure. And so the fact that we have here again a society that has paid a much higher cost than the rest of the quote unquote civilized world, kind of actively being on the front, never having the war have ended at this location.
Yeah.
Um, and so the fact that this king has to welcome these people and then immediately come to the terms with the fact like they're not here to help and he's just okay with it. There's something very noble in that. And I guess that's where Faramir gets in Lord of the Rings eventually, right? But it takes him a lot longer than this king seems to take.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting to me about this is just the pure level of contrast that we have between the kind of major regions that we've seen so far, right? Because in both the Two Rivers and in Camelin, we have heard people say they didn't believe Trollocs were real. And when you contrast that against Shinar, where they just spent the winter not with the first time ever the Trollocs have invaded, they just called it a bad winter for Trollocs, right? This is life in the borderlands. And so I think that is something that is a little bit even distinct from some of those other stories you're telling, right? People in the Shire would know that Mordor exists in theory.
Yeah.
I don't think that like the people in the Two Rivers are even aware that the borderland is a real place where real people fight real Trollocs. And I think that that contrast is really interesting. The other thing that I'll say that I found really intriguing here is, as you're saying, a lot of people kind of see Lan as the big hero rather than Moraine. But I also think it's really interesting to see how other Borderlanders act and behave, because so far the only person from even remotely this region that we've seen is Lan, right? Malkir, where he is from, is just to the north. We'll obviously talk about this a lot more in the next chapter, but this is kind of the first time that we get to see what other people from that society are like. And I think we learn that Lan has a lot in common with these people, right? They tend to be relatively straightforward and to the point. They tend to be really goals oriented, but he also is very different from some of them, right? Agelmar just seems like a cheerful, talkative person. That is not what we have seen out of Lan. And so I think it's interesting for the first time to get to pick apart a little bit of what of that character is cultural and what of that character is kind of the unique facts of his upbringing and how, he's lived his life. And those are clues that we haven't gotten. And I'm always curious to see that for a new culture like we're seeing in this story. Were there any of those details that stood out to you, or anything about Lan's reaction to these characters?
Well, let me add one more detail that I thought was really striking about this culture, as you said, because you're right, like trying to figure out the details and picturing these as very distinct cultures in these different regions seems key to understanding Andor, right? Yes. And is that the continent? Andor.
No, Andor is a kingdom
Okay.
in the continent that doesn't have a name. It's commonly
Okay.
referred to as Randland by fans just because
Oh.
it's easy. Yeah.
um, so the one detail that comes out in this kingdom is how, or the one detail you haven't mentioned, I should say, it's not the one, is how much they value Loyal, right? And
Yeah.
that they honor him and they recognize the contribution that the Ogiers made, and essentially like you made the walls, we only survived because of you. And, whereas other societies are quick to build over what the Ogiers created and to tear it apart, this was very clearly like, no, 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 like you bow to no one, sir, right? Like
Yeah.
that kind of attitude. And I thought that was very striking. And to me, that means it's a culture that understands the world differently. Perhaps that's just a much more a deeper appreciation of time and
Yeah.
contributions that happened ages ago, or perhaps it's because these have been saving them this winter.
Right. Well, and I think it's very telling that not only do they kind of still have this reverence for the Ogier as the builders of these walls that have preserved them for so long, but I think they also, in kind of talking to Loyal and kind of honoring him, they are constantly doing so in the old tongue. Right. And so it's
Mm,
clear that not only is this something cultural, their association with the Ogier, but as you're saying, it has something to do with like preserving traditions. And so I think it probably tells us something. This is the only society we've seen so far that is speaking this 3,000-year-old language. That probably tells us something about the way they preserve traditions and how long they're holding on to things. Because if we think about it, Loyal has talked about Ogier building things and growing the groves thousands of years ago. So
mm.
that's presumably how long this kind of tradition of honoring the Ogier has held on. And I think that's pretty crazy in a world as full of upheaval as Robert Jordan is building.
Yeah, and as we think about, I'm thinking about all the politics we just left behind that seemed
Yeah.
so currently of the moment in Camelin, like who's going to be the successor, who was the what drama happened one generation ago. It's just so striking that there's such a strong difference here. And
Yeah.
I'm still thinking we were going to Tar Valon for so much of this book, but like that group is headed there, and this group is now beyond that. I'm still wondering if all those pieces. Well, I guess now my mind goes to I wonder how many books till I see all those pieces kind of come together or change. But certainly, it's interesting to have those vast differences there. That seemingly those that are most important have no sense of the ancient, whereas these ones who have largely been forgotten and taken for granted have a deep appreciation for the ages.
Yeah, and I think that that idea of different cultures having different levels of connection to the past is going to be something that we'll need to grapple with going forward, right? Because we've now experienced two kind of very different versions of this. We've seen Shinar that has this strong kind of cultural connection to the past, and also just it has a duty that is directly tied in with kind of the ancient whatever happened that created the blight. And then we have the exact opposite of that in the Two Rivers, what was once Manethrin, right? People who don't remember anything, and
Mm.
yet the strength of their connection to that land seems to be really, really powerful, right? The way that Moraine is talking about the old blood when it regards Matt or Perrin, and the way that they're speaking the old tongue, I think that really should tell you something, that there are so many different cultures with different connections. That's something we should be keeping an eye out for with kind of any culture that we start to look, is what is its, connection to the old ways and to deep time. That I think that's something that Robert Jordan is doing a good job with the first couple cultures we meet of signaling. That's something we should be looking at. And then simultaneously at you say, but what has been lost in the process of developing those connections? And I think those two questions will drive things quite a bit going forward. Um, Honestly, unless we want to have the big Padan Fain conversation now, which I think fits better in the next chapter, that's all the stars in my notes for this chapter. Was there anything else you wanted to make sure we covered in 46?
No, I agree. Most of my stuff can be shuffled over. The one thing is just again, there seems to be this clear, easy plan is we'll have a big battle over at Tarwin's Gap, which I keep wanting to call Tarkin's Gap as a Star Wars fan. Um, and this again feels familiar, right? It feels like the 300 or something. Well,
Yeah.
not quite that, but or the film Return of the King, especially where they go have a big battle at the gate so Frodo can sneak off, right? Like we're going to try a stealth mission with our little group getting
Yep.
to the eye, but we need a big distraction to take the focus off of them. I guess in Lord of the Rings it's much more literal, whereas this
Yes.
is still metaphorical. So yeah, I think I'm good, and I would love to hear your summary of chapter 47, More Tales of the Wheel.
All right. In chapter 47, we begin with all of the characters who aren't Moraine, Lan, and Padan Fain basically being led out of the room and having to kill time while Moraine is asking questions. Initially, Agelmar is trying to basically placate the girls. He's trying to kind of keep them entertained. But very quickly, it becomes clear that Egwene has an agenda, because she wants to find out about Lan, although it soon becomes apparent that she is either asking on behalf of Nynaeve, or Nynaeve is just as interested, if not more interested, than Egwene is. Agelmar seems happy to tell him, and gives an enormous story, which I'm sure we can discuss in a little bit more detail, all of the ins and outs of it. But the long and short of it is that Lan is a king without a kingdom. His father was the king of the kingdom of Malkir. Through a very convoluted story, he was betrayed and Malkir was lost. And Lan was one of the few survivors trained by the best, basically to become a symbol of vengeance for Malkir, or to, avenge the loss or whatever. I forget the exact wording of his oath. In this discussion, a few things become apparent. One is that Lan has a very tragic past. He was originally let out, but I think like 10 bodyguards, and only 5 of them made it. And of those, all of them were injured. The other, I think, really notable thing that we pull out of this is that it is stated that Lan is the best of the warders. And according to Agelmar, that makes him the best of the best. So I think earlier in chapters, we had been asking, is Lan for real? Lan is for real, seems to be the answer to that question. At this point, Moraine arrives, and literally the first thing she does is washes herself, which I think tells you where Padan Fain is at this point in his life. She then describes what happened to Padan Fain, and it should immediately ring as Gollum to all of us who think about the Lord of the Rings as often as Greg apparently does. Apparently, 3 years ago, the Dark One did something to Padan Fain that changed him in a significant way and allowed him to basically become a hound, searching out whatever the Dark One was looking for. With every year in the Two Rivers, he became more focused on a smaller group of people. This year, he had basically limited his search down to Rand, Perrin, and Mat, and as a result, he brought the Trollocs to the Two Rivers, and ever since has been following Rand, trying to basically get to the three boys and turn them over to the Dark One in whatever way he can. That's more or less the chapter. We get kind of two big lore drops and not a whole lot else in between. I assume we're going to take these chronologically, Lan and then Padan Fain. So I'm curious what your reaction was to the big Lan reveal, because we obviously get a big bunch of kind of backstory that we'll need to dissect, but we also just get the big moment, Lan is a king. How did that land for you?
I don't think I suspected it coming at any way. I certainly never questioned his skills, but I had no reason to think he had this kind of royal lineage and backstory. Again, because I think about Lord of the Rings all the time, it sounds a lot like Aragorn to me. But it is striking that we have so many chosen ones in this crew. Like, the backstory of Rand, the backstory of Lan, the backstory of Loyal, even like all of these in their own book could be like a great protagonist, and yet we have them all pulled together and coming together in this one story and this one quest. So I think that the amount of that layering really has surprised me as time has gone on. I think I assumed we would learn much more about Rand, but we've kept everybody pretty equal in like our consideration and how enriched their backstory becomes, with a couple exceptions maybe, but there's a lot there.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to me about this is that Lan's story isn't a simple story, and the story
Mhm.
of Andor wasn't a simple story. And as we're learning, Rand's story is very much not a simple story. And this is how I think Robert Jordan gets away with having so many people who are, the chosen one or the great one, right? We have the first person to speak with wolves and whatever Rand's Taviran nonsense is, and a king, and Nynaeve and Egwene both being able to channel without being taught. And so much uniqueness is going on in this party. But I think it works because each one of them can stand on their own as an interesting story with nuance and detail, right? I've read the fantasy stories where it's like, okay, the main character gets a really well flashed out backstory, and the other ones are kind of sketches. And Robert Jordan isn't here to play that game, right? He wants to have 15 fully fleshed out characters. And that's a challenging thing to do, but I think he pulls it off well. Tied up in that, interestingly for me, is how all of the characters react to learning that Lan is a king, right? Because we are in Rand's head, we get to hear he is surprised, but doesn't seem to have any immediate strong reaction. The strongest reaction seems to come from Nynaeve. And we've been trying to piece out what's going on with Lan and Nynaeve a few times throughout these chapters. So I'm curious whether you read into anything at all in her reactions to hearing all of the story, because I think she's the character focused on most other than Lan himself.
I have literally nothing in my notes related to that. So it clearly did not register maybe in any way. But before, I think when we've characterized their relationship, it was at first it was kind of rivalry, and then it was more like game recognized game. I think we said in some previous episode, probably like
Yep.
30 episodes ago. Um, so it feels to me like if there was any competition still in that relationship, this just ends that, right? Like, oh, great, you're the chosen one of some other story where we're not in. But yeah. So yeah, I think that's where my head goes, but I have nothing on her reactions in this chapter.
Absolutely fair. I think at this point, then it probably makes sense to do
Ooh.
the quick summary of as much as I can the Lan backstory lore dump that we get
Well,
because it's. Oh,
here's
go
my
ahead.
notes on it. A plot full of intrigue, colon, Lan is a king. Because it was very much that type of a palace intrigue type story with rivalries and so on. So
Yeah.
okay, give us the full blow by blow because I'm sure it matters much more than my summary allows.
I think mostly what I am looking for here, this is something I do with my students a lot. It's like, I don't need you to remember everything. I just need you to know that these words are words when they come up again, right? Okay, so Lan's father, Al Akir, had a brother, Lane, and they were apparently either twins or close enough in age that either of them could have become the next king. Al-Akir became the future king. It's actually worth noting his name would have been Akir until he got the prefix Al when he was a future king. Um, Lane's wife, Brian, was very upset about this development. It seems that she basically assumed she would be marrying the king. And so she betrayed her husband, Lane. He was killed after she dared him to go into the Blight and battle Trollocs. She then allied with another individual, Cowan, and they betrayed Malkir, allowing the Blight to enter Malkir. Brian fled with her son, Isam, but is assumed to have been killed as she was being chased down by Trollocs as she fled. Cowan, on the other hand, was captured by Jane Farstrider. He was forced into trial by combat and was slain by Al-Akir, who then immediately went north to try to hold off the Trollocs. He failed, and Lan was then evacuated, barely making his way out. That's a lot of names. The one that is interesting to me beyond just listing everything is we have had our first mention in this description of Jane Farstrider as a real life person, but we have heard references to Jane Farstrider at earlier times in the book. We have actually learned a couple of times that Egwene's favorite book is the Travels of Jane Farstrider, and
Hmm.
Tam's favorite book is the Travels of Jane Farstrider. And this is the first time that we have actually learned that Jane Farstrider is a real person who apparently, at least at one point, lived in Malkir and was involved in the capturing of the person who betrayed the kingdom. So that's just an interesting detail amid what you say otherwise. I think you're right. It's kind of court intrigues soup. Is there anything in that description that jumped out at you or you thought was interesting, or is it just a pile of words and names, as I kind of usually assume these things will be?
The other thing I have in my notes is Isam, a loose end. So,
Yeah.
right, we have a baby that is assumed loss, right?
Yep.
And to me, in fantasy books, that means get ready for Isam to come try to
And
claim the throne or some such.
this is
Isam is not Lan, though,
correct.
right?
Correct.
I had my doubts when you were just going through the description. I'm like, did I
E-
mess up? Is Isam Lamb?
e-
Lan? Sorry.
Isam would be Lan's his father's brother's son. It would be his cousin.
Yep.
Yeah.
Father's brother,
Um,
son. Yeah.
it's also worth noting this is our second set of royal loose ends because
Mm.
when we heard the description of the Andorran royal house in the previous generation, we learned that the previous daughter heir and her brother, the brother vanished also in the Blight, and then
Mm.
the daughter heir disappeared afterwards. So
Huh.
we now have two sets of vanished royal loose ends. This is definitely something we should be keeping an eye on and keeping all of these names. Isam, and I don't even know if we got the other two. No, Luke and other one. Look it up in your
Mm.
notes.
Okay. Somebody look it up and then tweet it at us. Ben's going to be all over that because I know he's a note taker.
That sounds
Uh,
correct.
I also was searching for a joke because we're sitting here in Boston. The Royals were just here yesterday. Did you see that?
I did not. No.
William and Kate were in town, and they even they went to Somerville to visit some green engineering spaces. The Boston Globe, I think, had the article that Somerville residents were worried they wouldn't be able to get to Market Basket. And the quote was, I didn't ask these people to come here. only in Somerville are the Royals referred to these people,
These
and
people. That sounds right.
are they in the way of Market Basket is just the most Boston thing I've ever heard. Sorry, non Boston people, this is hilarious if it doesn't translate to other regions of the country, let alone the world. But yes,
Igraine is the name of our other
there it is.
royal loose end. I should have remembered that. That is the big kind of lore dump version of the story. Um, is there anything else in the land section that struck you as interesting or important, or are we land out at this point on the podcast?
Only that he could raise the golden crane and call an army of his former countrymen to his cause. And this is what the king had hoped he would do to help at Tarwin's Gap. And then
Yeah.
he both is not, that's not part of Land's plan. And he also seems unwilling to assume that mantle, right? It seems there's a literal reason and a kind of symbolic reason why he won't do that.
Yeah, and I think the reaction that Lan has early in the chapter when someone asks him about this is really telling, where there's clearly someone who knows him well. A character named Ragan, I think, approaches him and seems really familiar with him, addresses him much less formally than all of the other characters, and just seems excited. He's like, are you raising the golden crane? I'm going to ride with you. And Lan basically just shouts him down and is like, go away. Right. And so I think that shows to some degree the vehemence that Lan has about not raising that banner and not creating the army. And we don't know his reasons for that, but I think that's a compelling kind of little mystery that we've now built, is what's going on with Lan's unwillingness to, use the power that he's been given. It's very similar. I think you already mentioned to the kind of Aragorn story,
Mm.
but I think it's well executed here, right? We still have the mystery, even as who is Lan is finally solved. Um, if that's what we've got for Lan, I now want to let you drive the conversation a little bit with Padan Fain, because there are lots of things I could bring up, and I don't want to tip my hand with what is the first thing that comes out of my mouth, referencing this character who we all
Mm.
kind of forget about the first time that we read this book.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of go through my notes because that's often the most helpful way for me too. So these are kind of my reactions in the moment, often with a toddler screaming adjacent to me, but hopefully still meaningful. So what I thought was most striking about this is it is a little bit of the like Scooby-Doo pull the mask off the person and like here's all the ways I was working against you over the last 22 minutes or what have you. And so I think there's a lot of that going on where it's like, remember this little detail? That was me. This little detail, that was me. So things that stood out to me, he's been a dark fiend for 40 years. That's a long time.
Friend, I'm just gonna start
Friend. Damn
reminding
it.
you.
Dang it. Sorry. Dark friend for 40 years. You mentioned in your recap, he brought the Trollocs to Emmons Field. We had figured out how they got there previously, but we didn't know who.
Yeah.
And then also mentioned 3 years ago, he met with Beazalmon. And at that point, formed a bond with the boys or to the boys to continue to seek them. And the power there was quite reminiscent of the coins, right? It's like
Yeah.
an ability to sense them, to not necessarily identify them, it seemed, but to be able to follow them and have a clear sense of where they are and call the forces upon them. And there was one other thing about how when there was something that happened, I think it was at the Shadow City, uh,
Shadar Lagoth.
Shadar Lagoth, how everybody was like, what could have possibly pushed them into that city, the Trollocs into the city and all that. And it's clear now that I think that this peddler figure has a power beyond the fades that was the force that could push them in and act upon this. So those are
Uh,
kind of my dumb guy impressions of this character.
Yeah, and I think that this is what we're kind of supposed to be getting out of Padan Fain at this point, is he's this very mysterious figure in that we thought we knew his backstory a little bit. He's just a peddler, and now we get all of this new information about him simultaneously. Things that jump out to me in the discussion that you just had. First off, kind of lining up with your discussion of Padan Fain's power, I think it's really interesting that Baal-Zaman gave him this power 3 years ago, and then Moraine is almost able to track how much more powerful he got every year by how much more limited he was able to get in his searching, right? She describes the first year he kind of arrived and just knew they were somewhere in the two rivers. The second year he had, narrowed it down to like children. The third year it was these three boys. And then Moraine actually connects that to Baal-Zaman's ability to influence the world, right? She says 3 years ago, Padan Fain had to come to Sheol Ghul in order to interact with Baal-Zaman. 3 weeks ago, Baal-Zaman was able to project an image that, along with Padan Fain, was able to push Trollocs into Shadar Logoth, right? And so she is tracing this kind of evolving amount of influence that the Dark One is having on the world. And I just thought it was really interesting that that is directly influencing how much kind of like dark power Padan Fain is seemingly able to bring to bear. And so the idea that he's almost leveled up every year for the last 3 years is telling of where we're at in this story, right? It's later in the game than I think we would have otherwise expected.
Yeah, well, and one question that came to mind is the prequel chapter that was added, prologue chapter. There's what
Yeah.
was bothering me, prologue chapter that was added for the later editions. Would that have been prior to 3 years? I know they were younger, so they were
Yes, I think that
younger than
is
that.
like 7 or 8 years before. So Padan
Okay.
Fain would have still been visiting, would have still been a dark friend, but wouldn't have gotten the infusion of power yet.
Sure. So what a good tool that becomes, right? Somebody who's known to be in this area and known to travel about anyway. So clearly a good get for the scouting of the dark friends. So um and it feels like he's at once not like a lieutenant that is super powerful. It's more like a tool than a lieutenant.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if he's redeemable because he seems so much under the control. Like he hasn't been making his own choices for a long time. So is it a tool? Is it a puppet? I don't know the right metaphor, but there's just, especially when he showed up last chapter, he was muttering and seemed to be bucking against the control, but having no choice but to continue acting in that way.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you are kind of grappling with how much of this is Padan Fain being under someone else's control versus how much of it is Padan Fain truly being, super evil and dark and what have you. Because the moment that stood out to me in this chapter, I think is the one that makes me least convinced that Padan Fain can be redeemed. The moment that jumped out to me is what happened to Padan Fain after the rest of the group got out of the ways, right? Because the immediate worry we had, you were thinking at the time, maybe it was someone positive behind them. It was like, oh my God, what happened to them with the Black Wind?
Mm.
It turns out what happened with the Black Wind and Padan Fain is he talked to it and it was afraid of him.
Oh.
And that's kind of a scary character beat for a character
Yep.
like this. That was the moment that I got kind of the most like eked out by. The other thing that I thought was really interesting in this section, just a moment that I really liked, is the way that the detail that Moraine pulls out that Padan Fain mentioned about Baal-Zaman was his fiery eyes. And I think that's just an interesting detail for me because I has always, when I read these books, assumed that was like a dream like effect, right? It feels like when Rand is in the Baal-Zaman dreams, there are some things that are kind of real and some things that are super dreamlike. I had just kind of always assumed the fiery eyes were a dream thing. And it turns out, no, no, no. He's just that creepy all the time.
Mm.
Were there any similar moments that jumped out to you as just like this, I feel like this section reads like horror to me. Was there any jump scare that worked effectively?
I mean, I think it's what I alluded to before. I think one of my fears is not being in control of yourself or of your actions anymore. So I'm gonna try not to overshare, but I wasn't worried about getting COVID that much. But I actually in my early stages I passed out and I was fine. Like I stood back up and I was fine, but I haven't passed out in like 20 years easily. And so that feeling just unsettles me of like there was a moment in time where I was no longer in control, and that moment's kind of gone. So to picture Padan Fain as perhaps experiencing 40 years of this potentially,
Yeah.
and that's kind of a familiar fantasy kind of trope, and we just saw it with Matt being kind of out of control. So that kind of I think that's always a fear of mine of
Yeah.
losing that control over your actions, and so that is so heavily prominent in this story.
Yeah, and I think that that's really interesting in light of the something at the very, very end of the chapter, which is that the entire chapter, Agelmar is pushing back against the idea that the boys should be the one guiding Moraine and Nynaeve and Elaine or and Egwene, right? He seems to be kind of convinced that it's the girls who are going to be battling the dark evil, and it's Lan and the men who will kind of be getting there. That's the traditional warder Aes Sedai kind of relationship, and the thing that changes his mind is that the blood of Manetheren runs strong in these boys. And I think that's really interesting in light of what you're saying, because it kind of highlights the fact that this thing that earlier in the book we were really doubtful of because it brought the boys out of their own control, right? They were shouting these battle cries in other languages. And I think both of our immediate reactions was like, oh, this could be really bad, sort of thing. In this world, that seems to be perceived the other way, right? It seems like giving yourself over to whether it's the flame in the void or whether it's, some external force, that seems to be much more kind of welcomed in this world. And so there's a little bit of a philosophical detail in there, I think. But also tied up in this idea of the blood of Manetheren being strong, we do have the interesting moment at the end of the chapter where Moraine says, I'm going to trust these boys. The blood of Manetheren runs strong in almost all of them. And I think that is a telling moment, both because she is hinting at what she knows and what she doesn't, and also because Rand's immediate reaction is to check in with Nynaeve. Did you tell her? And Nynaeve says no. So this is kind of a new wrinkle for Rand in his relationship with Moraine. I'm curious whether you caught that exchange and what you thought of it as you were kind of parsing it apart.
Yeah, that was my penultimate note. And I want to bring up my last one is why I specifically get to deploy the word penultimate. But it did stand out to me that he's separating she is separating him from the group, and it unnerves him and causes him to doubt. And while I think it's only to me it reads with a bit of dramatic irony, because while they're saying this, we know there's something bigger to Rand, and if we're just getting the explanation that blood matters a lot, it's like, okay, then let's figure out where his blood is from, and maybe there's a higher power than that, something stronger than Menetheren. So it is to me a moment where he's nervous for good reason, and yet I was not. I was less nervous. I was like, yeah, but you got something stronger than that Manetheren blood in there. So that's how I read it.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely a really interesting way of reading it. I think that Agelmar's reaction to it is so interesting too, right? Because similar to how we talked about Loyal's reaction to Manetheren being really interesting, Agelmar's reaction is basically the same. He says, "Oh, you have the blood of Manetheren. I know that story. I respect Manetheren," right? And that's a
Mm.
2,000-year-old story. So the amount of weight that is given to this deep history, even within the world, is always been kind of shocking to me.
And stories there as
Yeah.
well, because again, way back to Moraine is here to collect stories.
I am very curious what, and I know I'm using this word incorrectly, but what your ultimate note is.
So the one thing that kind of struck me at the end of all this is I I realized here that we so often get these big revelations in this structure, which is it happened exactly in this similar way with Matt, which is Moraine goes off screen and she has this really intense discussion. And Robert Jordan could easily have put Rand in that room and we could have gotten it directly. But instead, we hear it second place. And
Yeah.
there's a power to that. But, maybe the world is starting to affect me. But it felt like, okay, so what's Moraine not telling, right? Because I
Right.
don't think she's going to give the whole truth about matters like this. And yet she's telling them a lot of scary stuff as we've been
Yeah.
recounting. So it's like, what should she be hiding? So my last note is really like, what's she leaving out? Because this feels like way too convenient a device for that kind of unreliable narrator, that kind of edited history, and then we can fill in more later because they weren't in the room. So
Yeah.
I don't even know that you can or should respond to that, but it was just striking to me that's like, oh, wait, I've seen this trick pulled a little bit before
Yeah.
as well, that we're getting a version of it, but we're deliberately not getting it from the source.
So I actually weirdly have three reactions to this. Number one, I think this is just part of why this is not one of my very favorite Wheel of Time books. It's because I think in almost any other Wheel of Time book, we would get a POV shift and we would have seen that conversation from either Lan or Moraine's perspective. This book is just so stuck in Rand's head that it's an interesting literary device to use, but I'd rather just see the conversation. Second, I'm not going to say that I'm not going to try to like give away anything. This is not an admission of guilt. But the problem that Robert Jordan has run into here reminds me of the problem that the writers of The Good Place had in season one, right? Those of you who haven't seen The Good Place, like skip the next 2 minutes of this discussion, watch it.
Go watch The Good Place and come back after
Yeah,
that.
once you finish
four seasons.
once you finish season one, you're good for
Okay.
this discussion. But they had the problem, they could not write any scenes that were Michael Janet scenes because it would give away the game, right? You couldn't have those two characters with no one else in the room because it ruins the spoiler that I am somehow avoiding saying.
Yeah,
right?
you're doing okay. Yeah.
I think Robert Jordan is not necessarily obviously for the same reasons, but I think he has painted himself into that same corner. He's made Moraine the central mystery of this story. Is who is she? Why is she here when she is? What was she seeking? All of these are really central questions. And so I think he's kind of painted himself into a corner of not being able to show any scene where Moraine isn't guarded around the boys. And I think that's the challenge that we're running into here. Third and final thing I will just note about this is actually something that I hadn't especially noticed until the television show gave us the other side of some of these conversations. So look forward to it. We will actually get a couple of things that Rand missed. We will be able to fill in the gaps in like a different strand of the multiverse.
Cool.
I think that is the ultimate comment you said. So did you have any last thoughts before we kind of make our way out of the episode?
No, I mean, we are at breakneck speed. As we were talking before the episode started recording, we have just a few more, and we're planning. I think we can reveal this now. We're planning to drop. I believe there's 3 more episodes this book. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so we're gonna. So this one that you're currently listening to should have dropped December 7th, and so we will then have the 14th, and then we're going to do a double drop for your Christmas break to close out the book on December 21st. You'll get the whole end of the book to kind of savor and read through at your own speed over the holiday break, as we academics assume everybody runs on our calendar because we're just selfish as it is.
Yeah, I think we kind of figured, different people are going to have very different calendars around the holidays, depending on what holidays you get off or celebrate or don't have any association with. And so we figured, we'll just drop the 2 episodes, and that way you can listen to them around your own calendar. And then we are going to do what academics do. We are going to take a couple of weeks off for the winter. I'm anticipating we'll probably be dropping the first episode of The Great Hunt on Wednesday, January 11th. Take a couple of weeks off in the middle there. We'll update you if that changes for any reason. But at this point, We are getting down to the end of this book. Next week, we are going to be reading chapter 48, The Blight, and chapter 49, The Dark One Stirs. And even in my much longer, crazy trade paperback edition of the book, I think we're down to 60 pages left. So it is time to start counting down. It is almost finished. Greg, take us out of the episode.
Uh, Apologies for any of my COVID brain moments. I think I kept it together, but it is what it is. So thank you so much for joining us yet again. We are so enjoying this great journey together, and we're gonna speed our way to the end of the book just because I am dying to know what happens. And Tylor won't tell me anything. If any, he gets off on withholding. It's really what it is. So we're gonna speed through for that. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you soon through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.